Welcome everybody to Introduction to the Cheating DQ. My name is Elaine. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a level 2, formerly from St. Louis, Missouri, now living in Calgary I normally say frozen wastes of Canada, but it's actually quite nice out right now. So I will not say that, but yeah, it is much colder, which actually I prefer a lot. It's probably like extremely warm in St. Louis right now or something. So there's yeah. Now I'm in Canada. It's whatever. So this is a presentation that I've done just once before. So hopefully not too many of you have seen it before. I'm going to be going over basically how to execute a cheating DQ or how to which involves a lot of different pieces, right? It involves defining what cheating is. It involves the investigation, like delivering the ruling, and also the paperwork afterwards. So I'm going to kind of go through a lot of this, executing the disqualification, like the procedure. So a little bit about me. Like I said, I am originally from St. Louis. I've been playing Magic since Gatecrash, so early 2013. Got my L1 about a year and a half after that. And ended up taking a bit of a break. Came back in early 2018. Had a bunch of people beg me to cert for O2, so I did. I wrote Bruce Lawyer, the bot that is in this server, and in a couple hundred other ones. And I mostly play blue decks, and if you don't know me from Legacy or Vintage Queues on Magic, on if you don't know me from the Legacy or Vintage Queues on Magic Online, or from judging, you probably know me as the one who takes down a lot of VRDs in St. Louis, or used to take down a lot of VRDs in St. Louis before I moved. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. So let's jump right into it with a definition of cheating. This is from the RPG. Hopefully this is something that most of you have seen before, but I just want to go over it real quickly. So a person breaks a rule defined by the tournament documents, lies to a tournament official, or notices an offense committed in their or teammate's match and does not call attention to it. So one of those three things. In addition, the player must be attempting to gain advantage and must be aware that they are doing something illegal. So that one of the first three things, which is breaking a rule, lying, or noticing their opponents breaking a rule or something. And then also they have to be trying to gain advantage by not pointing it out or not saying anything, and they have to be aware that they are doing something that is not allowed. So there's a lot of things. Okay, let's go. Is this cheating? A player knowingly casts a brainstorm into an opponent's Chalice of the Void with one counter and hopes that the opponent will miss the trigger. Is this cheating? No. No. Lots of people say no. Cool. Yeah, this is not cheating because the person has to actually break a rule as defined by the tournament documents. They must have actually broken a rule, and even if this player thinks that missing this trigger is against the rules, that doesn't matter, right? It's still not cheating. Obviously, if they're trying to get away with this, I might watch them, because if they try to get away with this, they're also likely to also try to get away with things that are actually not allowed. If to clarify, if this is something that they think this is not allowed, then I would probably watch them. But yeah, they're not obligated to point out the opponent's chalice. This is something that I do personally do very aggressively. I will always chalice check my opponents, because I mean it's allowed and I will do it. Also because I don't like chalice. So, all right. What about this one? A player allows their opponent to find Blood Crypt with Misty Rainforest, and they don't call attention to it because they're going to win next turn anyway, and they just don't want to bother getting a judge involved. Is this cheating? What couples saying yes, couples saying no. Does someone want to back up their answer? Several people are typing. It's still an illegal action. No intent to gain from the computer action. No, because no advantage is gained. Yes. Yeah, so the player must be attempting to gain advantage from their action. Technically, this is something that it is failure to maintain game state. Still not allowed, but it is not cheating, right? Obviously, if the player is trying to gain an advantage, like, they notice that they found Blood Crypt, and now it's like, oh, that means they don't have green up. Um, that that is still a problem, right? So I would still do an investigation here, but if the player says, I'm gonna like do XYZ and they're just gonna die anyway, it doesn't matter, it's probably fine. I mean, I would still say you should point this out, but they're not cheating, right? All right, third part. A player sacrifices Windswept Heath to Knight of the Reliquary because she doesn't pay attention to what land she was sacrificing. Is this cheating? No, must be intentional to count. No, because no intent. No intent. Yes. So the player must be aware that they are doing something illegal, right? In legal standards, this is called mens rea, which means guilty mind. And if you break a rule on accident, that is not cheating. What was her life total? That's a good question. I mean, in this case, I'm saying she didn't pay attention to what land she was sacrificing. So just kind of take that at face value for now. But yeah, so like breaking a rule on accident is not cheating. Last one here. Sure, I'm not gonna like tell them that, but also, yeah, they're doing something because their brain misfired somewhere. It happens. It happens to everybody. Okay, last one. A player notices that his opponent activated the -3 ability after Fairy Time Raveler and didn't draw a card because he thought it was a trigger that could be missed. Is this cheating? Not cheating, says someone. Anybody else? No, again, intent? No. Doesn't know what was being. Yeah, cool. So this is to demonstrate that basically that last part, the intent, there's two parts to it, right? It's not only that they have to know that the action is, sorry, they not only have to know that the action, that they're taking this action, that they have to be consciously taking this action, but they also have to know that the action is not allowed, right? So they have to be aware that they're doing something illegal. So there's all of these pieces to cheating, and they all have to, and you basically have to verify that all of these are true. So I just want to also not a detrimental trigger. Yeah, I mean, it's not a trigger, right? It's just the ability says it does the thing, but that's not the point here. Okay, I like this. One more here. Okay, so during a deck check at a Legacy event, a player is discovered to have 4 copies of Tinker in her deck. When questioned, she says she knew it was illegal and was hoping to get away with it. Is this cheating? This situation actually is cheating. Yes, yes, yes. Lots of people are saying yes. Right? Like, this is pretty obvious. That this is this is cheating. And I want to have a really clear example in here, but also obviously, like, real life examples are not this easy, right? Players can and will lie, and you're not going to be as certain as that. Does this happen? No. It does. It doesn't. But also, that's an example that I've seen from a lot of different judges and a lot of different presentations who basically get like, this is what cheating is. Now moving on. And it's like, well, that's not helpful because obviously that's cheating. But like, how does that apply to a real life situation that isn't going to be that clear cut, right? So the point is, just do the best you can, and it's okay to mess up as long as you learn. So how do you figure out if someone's cheating? Because they're not just going to tell you, right? The traditional way that people describe this in the judge community is called collateral truths. I'm not a huge fan of this term because it is a line of reasoning that applies to a lot of different things, but the term collateral truths is actually only used in this context in magic judging, as far as I can tell. In a legal sense, it means something completely different. Well, not completely different, but it's used in a different way. Um, at the last presentation I did, someone's like, "Oh, this is just inductive, like reasoning," and I didn't think about it that way, but it actually is. So if you're familiar with that concept, this also applies to that. Also, the way that I am describing this is going to be slightly different from the traditional way that people describe collateral truths in judging. So if you're familiar with this concept, hopefully you learn a different perspective. And if it's like, wait, that's not how I learned it, just chill. It's fine. It's fine. So the idea is, can we try to get a little bit less off topic here? I'm just trying to get this moving. I have a lot of content here, so yeah. The solving in modern. Yeah, I mean, there are people who don't know legalities and stuff. It's a whole thing. Okay, cool. So the base idea of this is that statement A is generally assumed to be true, and you don't necessarily learn that statement A is false, but you learn that a different unrelated statement is true, which makes statement A less likely to be true. So basically, you have to construct scenarios given statement B where A could be true or false. And then from that, you can determine whether A is actually true or false by figuring out which of those scenarios is the most likely. So to be more concrete, normally you assume that players have not cheated, right? Like we don't go into judge calls assuming that players are cheating. But if you see that a player has done something that looks extremely sketchy, that doesn't necessarily imply that they definitely have cheated. But depending on that, you can then figure out, what are the scenarios in which the player did something that's sketchy, but it's because they were being an idiot or because it was just not clear, versus they did something sketchy because it actually was sketchy and because they are cheating. So you figure out which of those scenarios is the most likely, and then you draw a conclusion based on that. So this is the classic example of collateral truths. A spectator claims that a player put 2 cards from his library into his lap and is able to confirm that you are able to confirm that there are cards in the player's lap. When asked, the player claims that the spectator was lying and he's not sure how the cards got there. How do you feel about this? What is your first reaction to, is this player cheating? I see 2 people saying yes. Does the spectator know the opponent? That's a good question. Not sure how the cards got there. Right, doesn't believe this. Too shady, more investigation is required. 2 explorers. It needs an investigation, yeah. The spectator is lying is in particular an odd reaction / claim. Yeah. You want to investigate further, but this is extremely sketchy, right? And this is the classic example, right? Like obviously, I'm not just going to disqualify them immediately based on this, but it's going to be really hard for this player to get out of it after saying, the spectator was lying. Obviously, if it's like the spectator knows the opponent very well and they're in cahoots and also even if they did, how did the cards get there in the first place, right? Like it's very unusual for cards to just appear in someone's lap and for them to not notice, right? It's pretty sketchy, and the player would have to do a lot of convincing for me to say, you're fine, continue playing, right? Maybe that's not super clear. I'm going to try a example from actually playing Magic, which follows the same concept, but it isn't related directly to judging. So this is, imagine that you're playing Modern. You're the blue-white control player here, and the opponent's playing Jund. You've untapped on turn 4, and you're slamming Jace the Mind Sculptor. So traditionally, in this matchup, when you slam Jace, you want to use the +2 ability right away so that they can't just kill your Jace with Lightning Bolt. That makes sense. You want to play around this card that they're very likely to have. So that's the statement A, that in general, you want a +2, right? However, in this case, you on turn 3, you had played Narset Predator Veils, and you had downticked. So you passed the turn with a Narset on 3. Now, if you think about it, if the player had Lightning Bolt, it's likely that they would have just Lightning Bolted that Narset, right? It makes sense. They had a good target for it. So because you were able to untap with a Narset on 3, it is much more defensible to now just brainstorm with a Jace, right? Because you have a that is obviously a better ability to be using here. And if that Jace isn't going to die immediately to a lightning bolt, then you're probably fine, right? So this kind of follows the same train of thought, right? Where it's like, just because this is what you normally do, you then have this new information that changes the calculus for whether or not the opponent has lightning bolt. I know a lot of judges don't actually play a lot of competitive Magic, and also this example is super outdated for current Modern, but I want to get a thumbs up, thumbs down on whether or not this example makes sense to people. It does. Okay. Yes. Cool. Okay. The other thing I want to point out here is that I've gotten some information where it's like, you know, I've pointed out to you that I've untapped with a Narset on 3. That is information that's going to change the calculus for whether or not I'm going to uptick this Jace. However, there's plenty of other information in this game. Like, imagine, for example, the opponent played Red and 6 on turn 2, and then you force a negation it. It's like, okay, that's information, but that information doesn't factor into this decision here, right? Life totals, let's say life totals, you fetch twice, they shot the over... sorry. You fetch twice, they haven't... Let's say they shocked once or something, right? Like, so life totals are 18 to 18. That's also information in the game, but that's not relevant to this decision. So part of following this sort of analysis is also figuring out what information is actually important. So when you arrive to a table and you want to start doing an investigation, you need to figure out what the questions are that you need to ask in order to actually change your decision. Like looking at life totals to decide whether or not you're going to uptake this Jace isn't actually very good calculus, right? Cool. So let's review. Jund usually has Lightning Bolt. However, they didn't kill Narset on 3, which means that they probably actually don't have Lightning Bolt. Obviously, this isn't a guarantee, right? They could have just drawn Lightning Bolt on their turn when they untap on turn 4. They could have Bloodbraid Elf, right? Like that also kills Jace. But then they would have to have untapped land plus Bloodbraid Elf, and then you still have a Narset, and it's like, yeah. And they could just be big braining you and like not killing the Narset for some reason, right? There's plenty of things that could be happening. But I think I'm pretty safe to determine that the Jund opponent doesn't have Lightning Bolt. The other piece of information I want to draw from this example is that collateral truths or inductive reasoning is not an evidential standard. What that means is that it's not going to tell you what % you need to be sure in order to determine that someone is cheating and in order to be willing to pull the trigger. You know, like tons of judges say, you know, you have to be 50% sure that someone's cheating, and then that is enough to pull the trigger. So some other judges say 80% or 90% or 95 or 99%, right? You're never going to be 100% sure. But, you know, there's always a percentage that people come up with. But and this isn't going to tell you what % you need to be at, right? In the previous example, the odds that Jund has Lightning Bolt is probably a bit under 50% in the first place, right? It's just, so like, if you are using 50% standard, then you're probably just going to always brainstorm with Jace. Yeah, I am scared of any judge who's prepared to DQ someone when they're 50% sure. I think a lot of people say that, but I've never actually experienced it. I think most judges are less likely to DQ players than myself, and I would put myself at probably the 80 to 85% range. But that's just my personal opinion. So like, and maybe like the odds that the player has lightning bolt and just didn't bolt your thing are actually like the odds that they're just going to draw lightning bolt off the top are probably like 7%. So if you're looking for a 99% certainty, you're not going to get there, right? Because they draw lightning bolt off the top is quite likely. Beyond a reasonable doubt idea is probably a good rule of thumb. Yes, but I don't know. Yeah, I think that makes sense if you're like accustomed to those sorts of legal phrases, but I don't think a lot of judges are. But the point is that this takes practice, that like you have to just have done a lot of these or have thought about a lot of these in order to, one, know what questions to ask, and two, know how sure you need to be feel comfortable pulling the trigger on this. It's just there's a lot of practice, and I think a lot of times people come into their first DQ and they're very scared of messing it up, and they're very scared because they don't know what they're doing. The burden for DQ should be less than is needed in a court. I tend to agree with this, yes. It is really scary. As much as it's terrible to say, I'd rather let 10 cheaters get off without a DQ rather than DQ an innocent player. I think you will find that is not an opinion that is shared by a ton of judges, but I think it is defensible. Okay. I'm just going to let people type in some comments, and I'll respond to them as they come in. 90 is a threshold. The other thing here is that I think people are bad at evaluating what percent sure they actually are. So it's like, I'm fairly sure means, and then they'll say, that means I'm 95% sure. But if you actually like do the math on it, it's like not actually that much. So that's the other thing. Can you share a story of the time that, yeah, I will go into times that I felt doubt about that decision. Yes, I will go into that. Judges are too scared to DQ people and should do it more often than we do. I definitely agree with this. Cool. All right, so this actually was one of my first DQs. So basically, I want you to think about what questions you would want to ask the players or what information you would want to determine about that game state. So a player appears to palm an extra card off the top of their library in the middle of a complex turn. And when questioned, the player says that they thought they were entitled to that card. How do you feel about this? What questions would you ask? Why did you think that? Okay, that's a very important one. So in this case, basically what happened with these two cards is the player cast Rebirth, sacrificing Ichor Wellspring, and their action was they drew a card off the Wellspring, put in 3 tokens, and then drew another card. And they just like didn't realize that they drew that first card. How many cards does the deck get in the combo turn? How often do they execute this combo? Those are good questions. If they thought they were entitled to it, why do they palm it? It's just that they appear to palm it, right? That like they just kind of did it very quickly, and it looked a little sketchy. But that doesn't mean the player actually was doing it. What was in your hand before you cast the Rebirth? Why did you cast it? Can you show me how you drew the card? Yeah. So in this case, this was actually one where I saw the player draw the card, and it looked kind of sketchy. That it looked like they were just like trying to take the card without the opponent noticing. What was in their hand before they cast the Rebirth? The opponent has no idea. This is not a deck that they're super experienced with. They're just kind of going through the motions. The deck is piloting itself, as some people say. Cool, yeah, so these are pretty good questions. So yeah, why did you think you were entitled to that card is the first thing that comes to mind. And the second thing is to confirm, is like, did you confirm with your opponent, can I draw this card? Um, which I think is important for those sorts of things, because often people will say, can I draw this, like whatever. And the third thing that I think people haven't pointed out is the ability to do a card count, basically to see if the number of cards that they have in hand or they have access to matches the amount that they should have. Obviously, this isn't always going to be possible depending on how late in the game you are, but it is still something that is worth looking into. And in this case, the card count did in fact indicate that the player did have an extra card in hand. I see a couple people typing. Going to let you do that. How many cards does the deck get in the combo turn? Okay. Process I've seen used for Wellspring. Okay, trigger Wellspring, draw off trigger. Yeah, that is basically. So here, basically, I think what I saw was basically I saw them draw the second card, and then it was like, wait, that doesn't look right. But I wasn't 100% sure that they actually drew the first card, because the first card I didn't really pay attention to. It's like, oh yeah, you should be able to have it, and my brain just didn't process it. But the second one, I was like, wait a second. Cool. Yeah. So in this case, with the player, thinking, well, I just drew a fourth swing, but also like they did actually have the extra card, and also they just kind of went through the motions really quickly. This one actually did end up being a DQ, but there are more questions that I would be asking depending on a lot of different things. I would be pulling the opponent aside as well, seeing like, what did you notice about this? But yeah, I would be leaning towards the DQ based primarily on the card count, that they did actually have an extra card, that they just like really couldn't explain. Cool. Okay, so let's do another example. This is a pretty common example. A mono red player has visibly curved foil mountains, and only the mountains, indicating a clear pattern of marked cards. And when this player is questioned, she says she did not realize the cards were visibly marked. What questions would you ask, and what are your thoughts about this? Several people are typing. How long have you been playing with this deck the way it is? That's a good question. When did you get those lands? How long have you had them? Why are only the lands foiled? Is it constructed or limited? This is constructed. That I should say before I let more stuff come in. Mm. So in this case, the player, it's like, I only have foil mountains. Like, those are cheap, and the actual like random standard stuff is not is not um is not foil, because it's just stuff that you have. If the entire deck is foil and curved, would it still be a problem? Technically, no, if the curving is the same, but by clear pattern, you can consistently cut to them. Yes. Are you okay with us switching your lands to non-foil basics? This doesn't quite answer the. This doesn't quite help you investigate the, like, whether or not they're cheating, right? It's just like something that you would ask afterwards, after determining that they're not. Yes. Why did you choose Four Mountains? Because they look pretty, right? Right. It's like you foil when you're able to. Does it though? Gauging the reaction to the swap might provide insight. I would suspect that if they're doing it intentionally, that they would alarm bells would already be going off in their head when you pull them aside in the first place. How long have you owed this? This one would be hard to DQ on. If it's the switching, it might imply that they're cheating. I do not see people implying that they're cheating. I don't see people actually saying no to their. Can I try to shuffle your deck? Yeah. So in this case, the foils are like you can cut to them. You can see them from the side. Can you show me how you put your deck when you're playing? That's a good one, actually. Okay. So yeah, this first one I should have been more clear. Do you like know of this policy means do you know that like about the marked cards policy and that you have to be sure that your cards all land the same way. Is it your deck or are you borrowing it? A lot of people said why are only your mountains foil, and also when did you sleeve this, right? Because different like how the deck lands, even if some of the cards are like slightly warped, how they sleeve it and like what sleeves you use can also impact that as well. Um, how are you in the tournament, winning or losing? That's a good one, actually. Can you actually elaborate on why what their record is matters? As opposed to other types of investigations, I don't think players' current studies might matter here. Right. I do think that if the player is more experienced, they are probably more likely to know of these policies, that know of the marked cards policy, and to be aware of it. Um, that doesn't necessarily always correlate with record, but it sometimes does. So, if this is the 7-0 table at a GP, I would be much more likely to have questions about this versus if it's the first round, maybe it's the first GP, maybe they don't know. Obviously, it could still just be their first GP and they're at 7-0, but it's less likely, right? It's something to think about. Yeah, so in this case, I think a couple of people have said that it would be really hard to DQ a player here, and I tend to agree with that. Um, obviously, like the player definitely could be cheating, but also I think it is also very reasonable to assume that they just like foil mountains and they just don't know, they didn't pay attention to it. That's like a perfectly plausible story, right? Like this is why the model that I described earlier matters because it's totally plausible, right? That it's cheating, but it's also totally plausible that it's that they just like foils and they only have mountains. Um, and I think that the odds that they just like foils, that's like a pretty common thing, makes it so that they're probably playing, but I would definitely be asking all of these questions. I think what Paul Bernet said about how you put your deck, like can you show me how you put your deck while you're playing does matter because depending on the orientation of your deck, it is more or less easy to see foils. Yes. Cool. A player cracks a fetch land and doesn't know the life loss. When questioned, the player says that she's tired and just forgot. How do people feel about this? Has she fetched prior life totals? This happens. Uh-huh. I've done this once or twice, it happens. Check with opponent's life total records. What round is it? What's the opponent's deck? I think it's an easy fix. Just be aware this is pretty common, but it does mean that it can be easily be opportunistic cheating. Just keep both players' life totals, not just your own. Yeah. What round is it? What's the opponent's deck? It's a good one. Is this the first time this particular GRB was committed? Have they fetched in this game or match? Are the life totals relevant? Ask if she's used fetches earlier in this match. So she probably like knows how fetches work, right? You know, if it's if she, I mean, I guess that's less likely now that like Fable Passage is a thing. With that, like people are used to fetching, which is not causing you life loss. This is probably an honest mistake. Okay, cool. So, to be honest, when I put together this question, I'm picturing this at, you know, the winning in to day 2 of a GP. The opponent's they're at 4, and the opponent's on burn. That's how I picture this, and that's what I put here, right? So like I didn't put any of that on this screen because when the player calls you over, they're not going to give you any of that information. They're not going to tell you that. But it is obviously very important, right? If the player is at 4 going to 3 and the opponent's on burn and this is the 6-1 bracket, that suddenly changes the calculus, right? And I think a couple people in the chat picked up on this, that these are important questions to ask. But I think it's something that, you know, this is the first thing that comes to mind, right? Is how relevant is this 1 point of life? And obviously, like, just because they're like all of these things are true, doesn't mean it's impossible that the player is just tired and just forgot, right? Like, in fact, if they're playing for day 2 of a GP, actually that probably makes them more likely that they are tired and just forgot, because GPs are exhausting. That makes sense. But also, it much more increases the chance that, you know, they are cheating if that life total is extremely relevant. Being game determinative changes a lot. Yeah, so like, but the thing is, you have to look for this information when you arrive at the table, because the player isn't going to tell you, like, hey, I fetched and I forgot to go from 4 to 3 against burn, right? Like, they might, I mean, but also, they probably won't. And the other thing I want to point out is that this is all information that you can get without actually asking the players, right? What round is it? You know what round it is. You know what record they're at because you can look in the match slip. What your life total is, you can get by just glancing at life pads. And what the opponent's playing, you can probably determine if they're on burn by looking at the opponent's lands, right? You can just get all of this information from without asking the players. So this is something to think about. Is it? So, and that's why I call this example hidden, right? Because the important information is not given to you. I'm gonna let a couple of people type, and yeah, with that information, it looks significantly more sketchy. obviously, like, have they fetched in the game/match? Um, or like, do you know how fetches work? Or like important questions to ask as well. But it's also important to look at other things that would be much more likely to change how you feel about this. I will send you this thing if you would like. I will put it in the chat later. Cool. So we have. I've actually gone a little bit faster than I thought I would, but there's a little bit more left. So the last part is. So you've decided that someone did a bad, and you have to do the paperwork. This is also kind of intimidating to a lot of people who haven't done this before. And this actually used to be more difficult, or not more difficult, but more intimidating because you went through the um, player investigation committee, which was like all of these high-level big-name judges, and it was scary and spooky. Now it just goes to wizards, which I guess could also be scary depending on how you think about it. But yeah. So the first thing is that you always want to double check with someone if you're going if you think that someone is cheating, always check with someone. Even if you are the only judge in the room, find a judge online, talk to them, give your reasoning, give how do you think about it. Like, obviously, if you're the head judge, it is your call, but you should ask somebody else just to like double check if you're at an FNM and you're the only judge there. Ask another store employee. They don't have to be a judge, but they have to like be able to at least follow your reasoning and see if it makes sense. But also, preferably, ask another judge, right? Like, ask a judge in a local group chat or something, just to make sure. Online console, yes. It's not, uh, yeah, and being an impartial to the situation if possible would also be good. Yes, them being an impartial is also relevant. The one thing I will say here is that if there's another judge who's playing, especially if this is a combo royale event, don't ask that judge because they're playing. And that's not super great. They're trying to focus on their match. Don't do that. Find a judge that is not in the event. If it's FNM, it's probably more okay. But if they're not involved with the investigation, but yeah. Second thing, deliver the ruling. This is something that it's important to tell the player that they've been disqualified, right? So when you've decided to DQ someone, you need to be certain, right? If you've decided this, but what the player says at this point could possibly change your mind, that means you're not really ready to deliver this ruling yet, right? Like, this is a big deal, and you need to spend the appropriate amount of time on it. Talking to as many people as you feel is necessary in order to do this. So there is a DQ one sheet that I will put in the chat afterwards, that basically you give to the player to be like, hey, you've been disqualified. These are the next steps. There's also one for the store owner if you are at an FNM and the store like isn't familiar with this sort of thing. There's one for them as well. And you also need to, before you talk to the player, decide with the TO if the player should be removed from the venue. If you're the head judge, it is your authority to determine if someone should be DQ'd. But afterwards, if the TO doesn't say so, they can still stay there. So depending on what sort of situation that is. I definitely agree with the idea that you don't apologize. It's not, I'm giving you this. It is, you have earned this. I hate to sound like I hate to sound like a high school teacher, but yeah, it's, you have earned a DQ, or like the actions that, like, or I have to do this because of actions that you have taken. The rules say, I think is fine. Yeah, so at this point, you have to be firm and final, right? Like, if the player continues to argue with you, which they probably will, part of the DQ thing says that that the player can tell their story, and at that point, it's, you say whatever you need to say, put there. Third part, write the DQ report. So keep it short. My first DQ report was 7 pages long. And the next time I talked to a judge who was on the player investigations committee, he pulled me aside and he said, "Don't do that ever again. I'm not going to read this." And I said, "Good point. I'm not going to do this again." So keep it short. Just keep it to what happened, why you think the player cheated, and how sure you are. So basically the important things. So just TLDR real quick, obviously with all of the important information, and also how sure you are is important because that informs them for like what future action is going to be taken. If you're not very sure, or like after a few hours when you're writing this, you feel less certain about it, put that in there, right? Because that's going to inform what happens to that player in the future. I've definitely been involved in a DQ where afterwards I didn't feel great about it. Whereas like, I don't know if I like how I handled that. And I put that in the report because it's like, maybe they didn't deserve to be DQ'd here, so treat them kindly, right? The final thing, DQs are hard, right? Like this is something that is difficult. It is very tricky. There's a ton of different moving pieces, and every situation is going to be different. That last part isn't true. Some situations tend to be quite similar, but there is a broad range of things that can happen, and it is hard to be prepared for everything. It will get easy. It will get easier as you do more of them because you have more experience. And hopefully the examples that I've shown you, which are actually like either examples that have happened to me that I've been involved in, or are things that I have heard from the judges as being actual things that have happened. Like hopefully that gives you at least a certain baseline of experience, right? That like it gets slightly easier if you are doing it for real. Afterwards, there was a huge tendency to beat yourself up if you feel like you may have not handled it properly, or you should have DQ'd someone that you ended up not, or you did DQ someone that you feel like maybe you're not so sure about afterwards. Don't beat yourself up too much. Obviously, like that does have an impact on people, but part of being a judge is learning, right? And finally, DQs are still hard. They will never not be hard. So that is it from me. I finished a little bit earlier. I feel like I may have talked a little bit more quickly than I normally do, but this leaves plenty of time for questions. And if people, I think someone had asked me for an anecdote earlier, and I forgot what exactly the question was. But if you remind me, I will go for it. Um, DQs must not be submitted by TOs through the WPN account? Yes. Oh, did you have a situation where you witnessed a DQ that you disagreed with? Um, hmm. I don't think I have an anecdote for that. I remember, so when the first, I've definitely seen situations where I was willing to pull the trigger and the person who was making that decision was not willing to pull the trigger. Um, at least for me, just because I think I'm either more willing to pull the trigger or I am more willing to like dig deeply into these sorts of things. Like, obviously, I'm not super into like competitive Magic right now, but when we actually did have paper events, I was like following like metagame super closely. So there were many instances where a judge was like, "This seems fine," but because of my metagame knowledge, I felt it was not fine. That tended to happen a couple of times. The other thing that happens along this line sometimes is that sometimes I will. There was one instance that sticks out a lot to me, which is that basically I ended up being involved in a disqualification where I didn't feel too good about it afterwards because I felt like I had entrapped the player into like I gave the player too much rope and they ended up just like talking themselves into a situation where they got DQ'd. And I feel like I wasn't super happy with how that turned out. Obviously, like with the things that the player had said, I think it was pretty clear that they should have been DQ'd, but also like I think I might have gotten the player too worked up to the point where they did actually end up saying those things, and I wasn't too happy with how that turned out. Sometimes the TO delegates that responsibility to the judge that was working the event. Yes, I think that's pretty common. But the TO does submit it. In the early example with the foil lands, can you pose the question of can we swap out your lands with non-foil ones and judge their answer to that? It is something that you can absolutely do whatever you want. If you're the head judge of an event, you can do whatever you want. I mean, within reason. I would not recommend this because I think trying to read body language is sometimes very difficult. There are cultural differences between even if you even if someone's like from the same country, there's regional differences. Also, I think there's a tendency that if you already think that someone is guilty, then you tend to look at things and believe that they are actually that like believe it reinforces what you've already decided. Um, let me. There was another part to it. The other thing about this is that I think if you're asking that question, I think it's pretty loaded. Where you know you're the judge, right? Like if you were saying, can we like if you actually wanted to swap out the lands, you could just say we are going to do this, and obviously the player can protest at that point. But I think if you were actually making that decision, you would just say we are going to do this with random lands from the land binder, or like something like that, right? Um, which, yeah. Hmm. The current DQ report page requires a DCI number. I have no answer for you. I have no idea. I'm sorry. I will try to figure that out, and I will get that answer. Or if somebody has a more, I, I think a lot of this paperwork like hasn't been updated because it's felt that there was less of a need to do so during a pandemic. Um, I I know like Tobiele has mentioned like there are things that we could change about the IPG and the MTR for like the newer cards, but we haven't because we're in a pandemic and there's not a lot of like large events going on. So that's like I think this might be similar. Judges no longer have access to the actual forum. Doesn't this weaken the power of judges in the scenario? Yes. Though I do think, if the TO trusts you enough to judge the event, they should also trust you to write DQ reports, especially if it's something that, is traditionally the purview of judges and also is something that, it makes sense that you would be doing that. Now the penalty is an event link. Yeah. My speculation would be that that's something that's going to be updated eventually. How do you feel about checking camera footage if available? I've never been in a situation where I've had to DQ, where I've been in a position to DQ at a event with camera footage. However, I would be okay with checking that as long as it doesn't take too long. Like the nightmare scenario of like taking 40 minutes to go through a DQ investigation and then deciding that they were clean and giving them a 40-minute time extension, that is not that's not great, right? So do it if it is readily available. And I know sometimes technology can impact how long it takes to actually find it. Yeah, I think the investigations are handled by people, so as long as like they know what it is, I think it's fine. It was during deck voting and took maybe 3 minutes. Yeah, that's probably fine. Any other questions? Yeah, I apologize for ending a little earlier. But yeah, I ended up talking a lot more quickly than I'm accustomed to. I think it's because of the like absurd amount of caffeine I've had this morning to be able to wake up at like 6:30 or something. Several people are typing. I like this. Can we chat about other infractions that get escalated to a DQ for cheating? Can you elaborate on what you're asking? I'm not quite sure. So, like, I've DQ'd for aggressive behavior before, but that's not cheating, right? That's a player being many things I will not say. What's your opinion on marked cards? Um, I am personally, I'm not very good at determining if a card should be considered marked, and I generally will try to ask somebody um, on if the card is like actually marked. Oh, multiple GRVs that have compounded. So if each of those GRVs is one where you think the player legitimately was just like their brain misfired and they did something stupid, like then it's not cheating, right? Um, like obviously if like they've committed 15 GRVs in an event, like that probably says something. But also people who are intentionally cheating, which I mean people who are cheating in like magic terms, um, actually don't tend to accrue a lot of penalties, I've noticed, because they don't like to get judges involved, right? They will tend to want to fix things themselves. So that's something that is. Don't think the IPG escalates GRVs to cheating straight up. Game rule violation upgrade. I can spell upgrade. Yeah, I don't think so. David Alden has a question. Only time IPG upgrades cheating is if the judge thinks the player did it intentionally. Yes. And also the other things, but yes. As long as we have a good relationship with the TO, this doesn't weaken our power. We still have the authority to issue the DQ. We can work with the TO for the paperwork submission. Yeah, I mean, like, I don't think that. I think it's very important to have a good relationship with like your TO. If you are the judge manager or the head judge on a large event, like you presumably have a good relationship with the TO. That like you probably may even be friends outside of a judging context, right? And if you're like the judge at an FNM, you probably are on a passable relationship with with the store owner, right? So a lot of this authority is like soft authority, where I think it is important to I think it's important to recognize that like we have authority because we are judges and not because of what privileges that explicitly entails. Yeah, I think that it is always important to like get a buy-in from the TO. It's not like required by the rules, but I think you should have a good enough relationship with the TO that either you can convince them, or if they're not familiar with this process, they should be able to just like they should be able to just like sign off on it without just being like, yeah, I trust you. It's fine. So, or if they're actually an experienced judge or they know how to do this, then they might have questions. But you should be able to you should be able to back up your decision, right? Like the DQ report says you have to like explain why you think so, and also you have to you have to be able to explain your DQ to somebody else and have it make sense, right? Cool. Yeah, I think. Okay. I mean, at this point, I'm just answering questions. So, yeah. If cheating is severe enough, the TO may want to ban the player from the store as well as DQ from the event. Yeah, that's definitely something that, like, you as the judge don't have the authority to ban the player from the venue, but that sometimes comes with a DQ for other things, especially for like aggressive behavior, right? Like aggressive behavior, you as the judge technically can't kick that player out, but the TO should probably be kicking them out. Yeah, yeah, okay. I mean, I'm done. I'm just there are people talking, so I mean, people are talking. People are asking questions, so so I'm sticking around. Uh, yeah. Okay. Cool. Cool. All right. Uh, Wait, that's not how this works. That's not the button. How do I do this? I do this. Cool. Okay.